Good evening. It's wonderful to see all of you here this evening, and it's a delight for me to welcome you, neighbors, friends, students, faculty, staff, graduates, here this evening for the 10th anniversary of the National Book Awards at Concordia College. Yes. There are times when I stand in wonder at my good fortune in being part of this community of learning, and tonight is one of those times as we welcome Anand Gopal and Evan Osnos to our campus this evening. And it is a pleasure for me as well to note that we would not be here at all. We would not have been here for the last 10 years were it not for the commitment of Harold Augenbraum, Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. Harold, would you please rise so that we can acknowledge you? I'm very happy to say that Harold will rise again at Concordia this May when he joins the class, when he graduates with the class of 2015, in his case, as a Doctor of Humane Letters. So Harold, we're so pleased about that as well. And most of the people know as well that this night would not happen without the imagination and the insight and the diligence of Tracy Moorhead of the Concordia President's Office and Scott Olson of the Concordia English Department, who have conceived and shepherded this event from its very beginning. And I'm going to embarrass them by asking them to stand so that we can acknowledge them. Tracy is here. Come on up. And it makes me very happy this year to acknowledge what you can see in front of me in the central banner here, that the National Book Awards at Concordia College are underwritten by Earl Lewis and Susan Whitlock. Susan Whitlock is an accomplished book editor. Earl Lewis, as many people in this room will know, is a 1978 graduate of Concordia College, a distinguished American historian, an educational leader, currently the president of the Andrew Mellon Foundation and a member of the governing board of this college. They're not here, but I'd like you to whoop it up anyway to acknowledge them. No one can whoop like Lutherans, so I want to give you all a chance. It's my real pleasure now to introduce a 1974 graduate of Concordia College and our host for this evening, National Public Radio correspondent John Yitzty. John started on radio on campus here as a student, KCCM in 1972. Something back there. John and I are exact contemporaries, so it was a ways back. But I think everyone in the room knows that John has long been NPR's lead correspondent on economic issues, and you probably also know that his portfolio keeps expanding as he covers major events in this country and around the world. John will formally introduce our authors this evening, but now would you join me in welcoming John Yitzty.
You guys come up here. Thank you, President Kraft. It is always a pleasure to come back here and to be among family and friends at Concordia College. And I'm especially excited to be able to participate in this really great annual event with two of America's finest young journalists. If you've read your book, read their books, you know that. And I've spent the day with them today visiting classes, and they are two really fine journalists and really great people. Let me first introduce Anand Gopal. He was honored as a finalist in the National Book Award Nonfiction category for his book, No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. It describes the U.S. war in Afghanistan from the perspective of the people of that country and reveals some critical mistakes that the U.S. made as it prosecuted that war. Anand has reported for the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor from Afghanistan. More recently, his work has been featured in magazines, including Harper's and Foreign Policy. So let's give Anand a warm welcome. And we are also very fortunate to have with us tonight the winner of the NBA's nonfiction category, Evan Osnos. Evan's book is titled The Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. And it describes the rapid economic growth in China, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and the rise of the individual, which is changing the country's culture, and the struggle of the Communist Party to retain control amid these changes. It, too, is a story told from the point of view of the people of that country, not the officials or the titans of industry. Evan has won a number of prestigious awards, including a Pulitzer and 2 Overseas Press Club awards. He's currently on the staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, and he was the New Yorker's Beijing correspondent for years. And before that, Chicago Tribune bureau chief there. During that time, he gathered much of the material for his book. Evan has also contributed to public radio programs, including This American Life. And I might say that Evan and I are neighbors, and his father and I actually worked together at NPR for some time. His father appeared on Morning Edition regularly on Monday morning. So if I call him Peter at some time tonight, please forgive me. And
and he would be especially pleased,
yeah.
I can tell
But
you.
let's give Evan a really warm
Thank you very
welcome
much.
as well. I know that many of you, and we've got a great crowd here tonight, many of you have read Evan and Anand's books and in anticipation of this conversation. But I'm going to ask them to give us a summary of each of their books to make sure that we're all on the same page. So, Evan, why don't you go first? Give us a summary of what your book contains.
Sure, and before I say anything, I just want to say a sincere and tremendous thanks to Concordia College for having us here this year. Anand and I both, I think, started writing our books years ago in anticipation of the 10th anniversary of this event. But in all seriousness, the commitment that the college has made to books and the technology of books means a lot to us as authors, and we're grateful for all of your participation tonight. For me, my book, Age of Ambition, is an attempt to encompass and explain what for me has been this persistent puzzle that has been a part of my life for 20 years. I got the China bug as a freshman in college. I had no background in the subject. I went into a class and was a class on contemporary Chinese politics and was just sort of electrified by it. And years later, we'll talk a little more later about how I got interested or how I sort of got started on it. But this book really was the way of explaining the place as it felt to those of us who were caught in the center of this maelstrom that is China's rise. And that's, we often talk about China in broad strokes, and we talk about the fact, which is all true, that it's a place that has allowed more people to lift themselves out of poverty than any other civilization in history. Your average person today in China eats 6 times as much meat as he or she did in 1976. That's how profound and intimate the change has been in their lives. But we don't often always talk about it through the experience of what it feels like. And so for me, this was about following people over the course of several years as their lives took, in many cases, some surprising turns. Entrepreneurs, artists, dissidents, criminals, also a young teacher who I'll talk a little bit more about tonight. But all of them in one form or another were united by the sheer fact that for the first time in Chinese history, they were animated by their own self-defined sense of aspiration. And that is a powerful force and a very uncertain force in Chinese politics, because it's not at all clear what it means to have a country of 1.4 billion people who are setting out to decide what it is they want for themselves.
And we'll explore all of those themes as we go on tonight. And first, tell us what your book is about. What's the basic message that you're trying to get across?
Well, I got interested in the subject because of September 11th, where I was living near the Twin Towers, and in fact, I saw the attacks, and I had friends who were killed in the attacks, so I was always fascinated by that part of the world, and eventually I moved to Afghanistan, and I switched careers when I was there, so I didn't have a translator, I didn't have any of the sort of accoutrements of a professional journalist, so I had to hit the road myself. I had a motorcycle, and I spent a few months going around the countryside. And what I found in those trips was that my preconceived notions of what the war in Afghanistan is about, and more generally what the war on terror is about, were very fundamentally challenged. The stories that Afghans told about the war were very different from the prevailing narratives that we have here in the West. And so I wanted to capture some of those stories in the book, and there's probably, I think I counted like 60 different stories in the book, but there's 3 in particular that I follow throughout the course of the book, starting from 2001 on September 11th all the way to 2013 or 2014. One is a Taliban commander who was a big Taliban fighter in the 1990s. Then he quit, tried to switch sides, and then became an insurgent commander fighting against the US military. The second is a member of the Afghan government who is a very powerful warlord who is allied with the US military. And the third is an Afghan woman who was a housewife who grew up in Kabul in a relatively cosmopolitan environment and then fled to the countryside and saw a lot of the upheaval of the last 15 or 20 years sort of up close because of that. And part of the book is about her journey in trying to get back to her home in Kabul and what that tells us about, well, what all these stories really tell us about the categories that we think of in terms of the war on terror, which is that there are good guys, there are bad guys, and we're going to fight the terrorists. But when you start from the point of view of the experiences of people on the ground, a lot of these categories start to evaporate. It's actually shades of gray, and that's really the point of the book, and that's what the title refers to as well.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the way the U.S. prosecuted the war in Afghanistan and how our intentions of ridding the country of al-Qaeda and the Taliban by hiring proxies simply made matters worse. I think that's a really important theme and something we should get out at the beginning of our discussion.
Well, this is something that really shocked me when in the course of my reporting, and these are one of the examples of things that challenged my preconceived notions, which is that when the U.S. invaded in 2001, they defeated the Taliban in the course of like 2 or 3 months. Al-Qaeda fled the country to Pakistan and to Iran, and the Taliban, from the rank and file all the way up to the senior leadership, more or less surrendered or tried to switch sides. And the reason they did so is not because all of a sudden they loved America or they loved democracy, but Afghanistan's been a country that's been at war for 2 or 3 decades, and people have learned to kind of switch sides, see which way the wind blows as a way of survival. For example, when the Soviets left in the late 80s, a lot of Afghan communists rebranded themselves as mujahideen or holy warriors. So in the same way, when the Americans invaded, a lot of Taliban tried to rebrand themselves, tried to switch sides. And so you're left with a very curious situation where there were no Taliban, there were no al-Qaeda, but there were thousands of US troops on Afghan soil wanting to wage a war on terror. But there's no enemy to fight. And the way that contradiction was resolved was that the US allied with local warlords and strongmen and power brokers. And in effect, the enemies of those warlords and power brokers became the enemies of the US. And so, if you had a plot of land and I wanted it and I had the ear of the US military, I can tell the US military, well, you're al-Qaeda, you're Taliban. back in 2002, they only had human intelligence, and so they would come and arrest you or send you to Guantanamo. And through that process, the Taliban was able to reconstitute itself and become a insurgent force that we see today.
And in doing so, the Afghan government was unable to gain control because these warlords became so powerful in the regions because of the U.S. money, so that the government itself was undermined, the central government.
Well, yeah, I mean, for every dollar we spent on the central government, we spent almost an equivalent amount on these warlords. So there's really kind of a situation of dual power in the country. The sort of the warlords that are allied with us, and then the government in the cities.
One of the most amazing things I think about both these books is that they're each a tour de force in reporting. These guys wore out a lot of shoe leather, going out into the country, finding people to talk to, gaining their confidence, and telling their stories. And I think what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is try to get at how you managed to do that. And let's start by having each of you introduce us to a character that you gained the confidence of and whose story you ultimately told, and then tell us a little bit about how you went about it. So, Evan, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll read just a paragraph or so about a guy named Jiang Zhiming, who I met entirely by accident, as is sometimes the case with the characters, the people, the stories that end up having the biggest impact on you. He was working as a security guard on the perimeter of an English language study camp when I met him. And I had no sense in the beginning that he would become important in my understanding of China, but he really was. When Jiang Zhiming was a child, the family lived in a coal mining town called Mine Number 5. His parents, who'd survived the harshest years of poverty and political turmoil, had only one goal in life, Jiang said, to pass the days normally. But Jiang was desperate to get out of Mine Number 5. In a passage that he wrote for class, he recalled, "I couldn't stand eating steamed bread, leftover greens, and sweet potatoes every day. I couldn't stand wearing the same patched clothes year after year when I was laughed at by my classmates. I couldn't stand walking 1 hour on foot to get to that old shabby school." With the help of loans from the coal mine boss, his father was a coal miner, Jiang went to college, where English became his obsession. He adopted the name Michael. In January 2009, he started a company called Beautiful Sound English, an English teaching company. I'll read just a little bit more. The quality of Michael's English always startled me. For someone who had never left China, he was clear and articulate, and he made relatively few mistakes in conversation and in writing, largely because there was almost nothing he wouldn't do in the name of improvement. When a music teacher suggested that he hone his pronunciation by holding up a mirror and making exaggerated movements of his mouth, Michael did that, even while riding the bus. It attracted some strange looks. Most of all, Michael scoured the internet to find English recordings that appealed to him, and then he recited them over and over to hone his accent. He read me one of his favorites. "Something amazing is happening at Verizon Wireless that will change the way America talks. Something big, something bold, something new." Listening to him, I realized there was a universal quality to the sound of salesmanship, even if you didn't care what it was you were selling.
So let's talk a little bit about how you found Michael and how you decided that he was going to play an important role in your book. How did you come across him, and how did you engage him?
Michael found me, which is often the best kind of, I'd be curious if Anand has this experience too, but oftentimes those are some of the most robust writer and source relationships where you are both equally avid in pursuit of the other in a way. I was writing a story for The New Yorker about the most popular English teacher in China, and who was an interesting enough guy, but also problematic. He turned out to be a real jerk, actually. He was taken to court by his wife, who accused him of domestic violence. One of the first, really a landmark case in China. All of this was to come, though. At the time, he was interesting because he was the most popular English teacher in China. So I'm hanging around at his school, and this young man comes up to me and starts speaking to me in English. And it was Michael Zhang. And he had been a devoted admirer of this student, of this teacher, but he couldn't afford a ticket. And so he had gotten a job as a security guard and had sort of listened in to the classes. And he was not a particularly good security guard, and we wandered off of his post. I wasn't sure really what the security risk was to the English class anyway. So we wander off of his post out into the sunshine, and we're sitting out there, and he begins to talk about his life. And he talked about his life with an honesty and a specificity that was amazing. And he said, he basically said, it's really hard being me, being a 26-year-old guy who's trying to get married, and my brother got drawn into a pyramid scheme and lost a lot of the family money. And he had a self-narrative that was that was available in a way that I think previous generations in China never would have imagined. And I know that because I tried to talk to his father. At one point, I tried to talk to his father about what it was like being in a coal mine. I'd blocked off the afternoon. I brought my tape recorder. His father had been a coal miner for 30 years, and I thought, what an epic drama. And so I sat down, and the father said, oh, sure, I'll be happy to talk about it. And we sit down together, and the father says, I was a coal miner for 30 years. I made 60 yuan per month. And that was everything the father had to say on the subject.
That was his personal narrative.
That was his personal narrative.
Right.
And in a way, it was a reflection of how much he thought he deserved to offer of his own story. His story, as far as he was concerned, was interchangeable and not particularly distinct. But Michael had a different view. Michael's view was that his own story was an epic drama full of triumph and tragedy and adversity, and he could talk about it with really brilliant and very brave candor.
And how did that transformation come about from father to son, this very different view of yourself?
In a way, that's what was compelling about writing about China through individual stories, is that he didn't actively set out to change what it means to be an individual and a citizen and a young person in China. He was swept up in all of these social, political, and cultural forces which are so profound, which, historically in China, the individual was not the relevant unit of measure. I mean, people didn't see themselves as being individually distinct. You were always understood to be embedded in these larger forces, whether it was the family or the factory or the coal mine or the military unit. In literal terms, if you were accused of a crime, for instance, in as recently as the Qing Dynasty, the last empire, it wasn't just that the defendant was put on trial, but also it could be family members or community leaders, because you were all understood to be inseparable. And one of the byproducts of this period of enormous economic dynamism and growth that we've been watching and talking a bit about tonight has been that it has transformed what it means to be a person. And the term, one of the words in Chinese that people use to describe the experience of leaving the collective farms and the factories, was that they said they had been songbang, which is to unfetter, but it's to unfetter an animal or a prisoner, and that's how essential the change felt. But Michael didn't know any of that. He just knew that he was living in a radically different world than his parents. Yeah. And the contrast between the two, for me, was irresistible as a story.
Anand, let's talk about one of your sources, one of the people that you profile in your book. Read a little bit about him and then describe how you managed to strike up a relationship with him.
Sure. This is the Taliban commander who I follow. His name is Mullah Cable, and he was called this because he wielded a whip and would go around on the front lines and whip those people who had weapons or who didn't pay taxes. And so I was immediately intrigued. I mean, what would possibly be wrong with you that you would call yourself Mullah Cable? So I wanted to track him down, so I eventually did. So what I'm going to read right now is the moment where I first met Mullah Cable. I first saw Mullah Cable on an early winter evening in Kabul, the hour of dueling muezzins, dozens of them crooning from their minarets. It was 2009, and more than 100,000 foreign soldiers were on Afghan soil battling an increasingly powerful Taliban insurgency. When I approached him, he was pacing uncomfortably in a park, hands in his pockets, his eyes shifty, a black turban stuffed into his pocket. Tall and lanky, he stood with his shoulders hunched, as if he was carrying some dangerous secret. He wore glasses, unusual for an Afghan. Tattoos flowed down his arms, and henna dye covered his fingernails. When he smiled, gold teeth glistened. Only his thick, spongy beard and a missing eye, a battlefield injury, placed him unmistakably among his Taliban comrades. Even without such telltale marks, though, as an Afghan, you can never truly hide. A cousin or an old war buddy or a tribal chieftain somewhere would know how to find you. So I had tracked him down, and after months of effort, I finally convinced him to speak with me. I don't come here often, he said. Kabul is a strange place. I'm a village guy. I need the open spaces and the fields to be able to think. As a typical Kabul evening smog settled in, commuters headed home, many with their faces wrapped in handkerchiefs. Toyota Corolla station wagons and minivan taxis, with arms and heads poking out, rattled by. A Ford Ranger police truck passed us, making Mullah Cable nervous. He had slipped in from the surrounding countryside and was worried about being noticed. We took shelter in a taxi, moving slowly through the darkened streets as we spoke in the back. I wanted to learn his story. At first, he was skeptical. I don't understand why it matters, he said. My story isn't very special. I think you won't find it very interesting. I assured him that I would. And for a year, we met regularly in the back of taxis, in drowsy, dark offices in Kabul, or out in the countryside. In his tale, I found a history of America's war on terror itself, the first grand global experiment of the 21st century, and a glimpse of how he and thousands like him came to define themselves under this new paradigm, how they came to be our enemy.
So this is during the time period after the initial American invasion, after al-Qaeda has been chased into the mountains, after the Taliban has essentially been defeated, right? And Mullah Cable was a member of the Taliban, but had now sort of left the Taliban and was trying to make his life somehow in this new reality, right?
Well, yeah, actually, when I met him at this moment, he was an active fighter.
He was still an active fighter.
He was an
at
active
this
fighter
point?
at that point, and when I say he slipped in from the countryside, he literally slipped in from the front lines to come and talk. But after 2001, he threw his weapons down and he tried to switch sides. He actually set up a cell phone shop at some point because he figured out cell phones were the new thing in 2002, and so he figured out after much trial and error how to fix them or how to get them to work. And so he sort of garnered a reputation in his village of being the cell phone wizard. And so people would come from miles away and bring their cell phone to him. And this worked well for a few months, but as he got successful, as he started making money, he became a target of police abuse. So the policemen would come and shake him down or knock down his cell phone shop. As this was happening, tribal elders in his community were being imprisoned, people were being sent to Guantanamo, and it gradually dawned upon him that he felt there was no space in the political system, the political order post-2001, and so he sort of reconnected with his old comrades and became a fighter.
Again,
became an insurgent, yes, exactly.
But prior to this, he had been engaged in significant brutality as a member of the Taliban, right?
Oh, yes, and I mean, Mullah Cable as an example. On the front lines in the 90s, he was part of helping to burn down some of the fields where people had grown raisins for generations. Also, after becoming an insurgent, he a number of times killed innocent civilians. Well, I think they're innocent, at least people that he accused of being a spy for the U.S., but there was no trial. He took them out into a field and shot them. So he's an unsavory character. That's no doubt.
You really want your cell phone repaired to go to the one-eyed, bullwhip-wielding mullah on the corner. But anyway.
You'd be surprised how many one-eyed mullahs were there.
Oh, fair enough.
You're desperate, right? So how did you meet him? How did you engage him? How did you contact him? How do you report a story like this?
Well, I mean, when I landed there, of course, I was very interested in the other side, the Taliban, and I thought for a while of how I could find a way to meet them without getting kidnapped, because they do have this unfortunate propensity to kidnap journalists. So it turned out, it was sort of fortuitous, but there was a very sweet man that I met who's originally from Malaysia, who was also, unfortunately, not a very bright man, because he came to Afghanistan with the idea of getting some weed and going back to his country. And so he got arrested, and because he was a foreigner, the Afghans didn't really know what to do with him, so they threw him in the cell, in the sort of the wing where all the Taliban and Al-Qaeda people were. So this poor guy was in this wing with like these insurgent bigwigs for years and years, and somebody in the Red Cross basically told me, hey, listen, this guy's really lonely. I happen to speak Tamil, by the way, and he spoke Tamil, and so he's like, why don't you just go pose as his relative? And so I did that. So over the course of a year, once a week, I would sneak into the prison on visiting day, pretending to be his relative. And over time, he introduced me to all of these people in the wing, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda people. And so eventually from them, I got permission. I got a letter actually saying, he is a journalist, he's not a spy, don't kidnap him. And I got this letter, and then I went to the countryside and actually spent 3 or 4 weeks with the Taliban out there. And through meeting them and meeting people associated with them, I was able to track him down.
I would have thought you would be, that sounds frightening to me.
Well,
You have a letter saying he's not a spy.
Well, there's this weird thing about Afghanistan where things like letters could actually go a long way. People have this respect for officialdom, even though there's barely a state. But the first time that I went to this group, I was told to go to this remote province and climb this mountain. It took me the whole day to get to the top. And I get there, and there's a small little cottage at the top, and I go into the cottage, and there's a number of these Taliban sitting around with Kalashnikovs on their lap, and I sit down, and I was really nervous, and asking probably very silly questions, or asking, why do you fight? And the guy just says, I fight because of jihad, and that was, that was it. And the interview went like this for a while, but it turned out that the commander, the head of this group, had never before met an American, and so he was very interested in me, so he started asking me questions halfway through, and he would ask me, this is 2008, so just when Obama was announcing the troop surge, so he asked me, why is your president sending more troops to Afghanistan? And so I tried to give him some political analysis of what was happening, and he asked, why did your country come to invade our country? And so I explained. But then he started shifting and asking about life in the US, and especially about women. So he said, why does your country allow women to just walk around naked everywhere and doing whatever they want? And I said, I don't know which part of the country you're really referring to, but and
Miami.
yeah, possibly. I was thinking of Vegas, but yeah. Then he said, have you ever seen the film The Titanic? And I said, oh yes, I've seen The Titanic. And he said, why doesn't your country make movies like that anymore? And because it turns out that he and his whole group were big fans of the Titanic, and they used to trade the VHS secretly during the Taliban regime. So that was my first taste of the Taliban in the field.
Wow. How about China? Certainly.
I got to tell you, the bravest thing I ever did was eat dumplings that had gone cold. I think we're two different species of reporters, but. Well, but, we're all courageous in our own way, John. And,
But certainly some of the people you interviewed were under threat and ended up in prison, some tortured, some beaten up. Was that a concern of yours as you were reporting this story, that people that you talked to might get in trouble?
Well, this is a thing that is on your mind constantly as a reporter in an environment, I think, much like the kind of environment that Anand's reported in. In China, it's different than in Afghanistan. I used to work in Iraq, for instance, where the sense of menace is that it's coming. You don't know where you're safe. You don't ever feel that you are on safe ground. In China, you don't feel ultimately really that you're at personal risk. The risk is exactly as you described. It's that the people who you're talking to are exposing themselves and taking a great gamble, in a sense, by agreeing to be quoted. And sometimes they'll say, look, it's okay to quote me, this is the right thing to do, and you have to say, I'm not sure in the end that that's the right thing to do, because it's hard for people to visualize just how fast a story that appears in the New Yorker magazine or appears in a book like this, that it really does actually filter back into Chinese political conversation and gets to the attention of authorities pretty fast. But I have to tell you, one of the harder things to decide is, you also don't want to be patronizing and paternalistic and say, oh, you know, you don't really understand the consequences of what you're doing, so I'm going to make this choice for you and say that your activism and your bravery is ultimately misguided. That's for me, I was kind of always conscious of that risk as well, because that's disenfranchising. Somebody has gone out of their way to get to me and has thought through the fact that they want to say something critical and something bold, and to then have me not to hold up my end of the bargain is also in its own way is a moral risk of a certain kind. But you know, in China today, it's gotten a little bit, not a little bit, it's gotten substantially more difficult actually to report. I was just there last month, and this is a very hard time to be somebody who's involved in the world of ideas. If you're a Chinese intellectual, if you're a lawyer or an activist, if you're somebody who is doing things that can be perceived by the state as a risk, meaning that you're posing some threat to political stability, and that can be anything, you really are at risk. And so that puts a responsibility, I think, on foreign writers to be at least as bold as the Chinese people are being themselves, and to say, if you have something that you want to say and you're taking a risk in saying it, I will do what I can to try to provide an amplification of that. But no, the risks that foreign journalists face in China are inconsequential compared to what Chinese sources face.
Has anybody regretted talking to you?
I haven't had somebody say to me that it was a mistake. But you're naive if you're not worried about it as a writer. And I mean, I can tell you that I had somebody say to me just a week and a half ago, somebody we'd done a long on-the-record interview when I was in Beijing, and he's a very seasoned political thinker and writer and talker. He knows exactly what he's doing. And at the time, he said, yeah, I'm prepared to say these things they weren't critical, actually, of the Chinese government, but they were getting to the heart of how power is distributed and how it's wielded and who's powerful. And a couple of weeks passed, and I was in touch with him again, and he said, you know, I can't do this. I can't publish this now. The mood is too tense. And that's not a hard call. When he says that, that's it. It's over. He's out. People have a very finely tuned sense of what they can do and what they can't do. They're not always right. Sometimes things happen and they end up getting in trouble. But you know, you do what you can to try to prevent that.
Are you aware of anyone who suffered consequences as a result of speaking with you in Afghanistan?
No, and the people that I was most worried about, I was sure to change their names, and in some cases not identify their home village, or, you know, these kinds of things. And I just returned to Afghanistan last week for the first time since the book came out, and so it was kind of nice to follow up with some of the people, those who are still alive,
Right.
you know, follow up with them and see how things are now. And we're working now on a official Pashto translation of it, and sort of the work there is very complicated because now there's more things that we need to change to protect people, but yeah, not that I know of.
Let's
Thankfully.
meet a couple more of the characters. Anand, why don't you introduce us to Hila, the woman that you profile in the book. It's a fascinating story.
So Hila is somebody who grew up in Kabul during the Soviet occupation, which is a very violent time in Afghanistan, except Kabul was kind of this island, this oasis, and it was actually quite progressive compared to the rest of the countryside where the war was. And so she grew up there, and this, I guess this passage that I'll read is from 1991 or 92. This scene takes place then. And it's about her meeting her future husband. One day during her junior year, her family brought home a young man for tea. It had become a regular occurrence, for at 19 she was well into her marriageable years. Hila was to stay quiet in the adjacent room until called. Usually, she'd be brought out to meet the visiting family. Some words would be exchanged with the adults, and then modesty would call for her to retreat again. This time, though, as she was introduced, she saw that there were no relatives accompanying this visitor, no throng of curious aunts. There was only a tall, pale young man standing shyly in the corner. He had a sharp nose, prominent cheekbones, and, it was impossible to ignore, a disarming smile. Gila knew that it would be improper to inquire about him openly, but over the next few days, she gleaned snippets here and there. His name was Muskinyar, and he'd come alone because his family was down south. He'd been living by himself in Kabul, something she'd never heard of before, working for the government. She also learned that he was a communist and a fervent defender of women's rights. Over the following few weeks, Gila registered her approval the way a good Afghan girl did, by saying nothing at all. During her daily walks to the university, she found that her thoughts were wandering to him. It was killing her not to know what the two sides were discussing or if they were talking at all. One afternoon, she had almost reached the campus when suddenly Muskinyar appeared in her path. Oh my God, she thought. They stood staring at each other. She could see the scandal, the tears and screams at home, the accusations about a couple skirting their families and taking matters into their own hands. Before she could say anything, he broke into a wide grin and announced that he would like her hand in marriage. Not knowing what to do, she turned and hurried the other way. She fought the urge to look back. And it goes on about how they end up meeting eventually. He convinces her that they should just walk together because he wants to know the woman that he's going to spend the rest of his life with. And a lot of her subsequent stories about how she and him have to flee Kabul and go to the countryside where all the progressive values that they grew up with are non-existent, essentially.
Right. She essentially ends up trapped in her own home, unable to go out because she can't go out without a male accompanying from her family.
Right.
And so she spends her life inside her compound until she begins to be asked by some of the government people to begin to give sewing lessons and that sort of thing. But it paints an incredible picture of someone who's come from a relatively enlightened view of life as a woman in Kabul to a life where she cannot go out without being completely covered, and another male cannot even hear her voice. That's a violation of religious or tribal laws. How did you meet Gila? How did you manage to get to her and be able to tell her story?
Well, she, when I met her, had moved back to Kabul from the countryside. And the thing to know about reporting in Afghanistan is that it's extraordinarily difficult for a male reporter to talk to women. You can go months without seeing a woman. And in fact, I was just in southern Afghanistan, I think, for a couple of weeks and didn't see a single woman. So the gender segregation is very intense and is very real. But I really wanted a woman's voice in the book, and so I had to think about how to get that. And Gila occupied a very particular space because she had this very unique background. Nowadays, unfortunately, it is unique that she grew up in this cosmopolitan environment in Kabul. She was also a widow when I met her, and so she occupied a slightly different space than somebody who may have been married would occupy. And so for those reasons, I was able to meet her. And in fact, I met her because I was interested in the third person that I profiled, the warlord. And I was interested in reporting on some of his crimes because he had killed a lot of people. And it turns out that one of the people he killed was her husband. And so it was actually through that and that I was able to meet her. And I was blessed in meeting her because she's an extraordinary storyteller, and she's also somebody who was very patient. We spent maybe a year and a half worth of interviews, meeting 2 or 3 times a week, and she would be patient enough to understand that I need to actually go and meet the people she talked to or talked about, and then come back and ask her the same questions again. And that's a sort of rare quality. Probably, I don't know if I would have that quality if somebody was coming in, intruding into my life, but she did. So.
Yeah, I've often thought, I wonder what it would be like if an Afghan reporter or a Chinese reporter came and said, I'd like to talk to you about your feelings about your wife and how you met.
Right.
And I'll put it into a book and it'll be available for everybody in China. And I sort of hope that I would be as open as people often are. I'm struck listening to those two very beautiful descriptions of these characters, about how, I sense like there's a change in the way that we write about other places, foreign places these days, that's a little different than we did it historically, which was, there was a period in time where part of the act of writing about a distant land was to explain how exotic and how unapproachable, how unimaginable, how, in the cliches about China, of course, were that it was unknowable and it was obscure. And now, actually, as a writer, I think we have similar intentions, never quite explicitly stated, but you guys can keep a secret. But at least, I mean, for me, part of the intention is to say that there is a lot of shared human experience in what's going on in these places that are, by so many other measures, very different. But we can understand that experience in a way that we need to, I think.
Introduce us to another of your characters.
After just monopolizing that subject inadvertently. I'll tell you about, we often talk in China about what's going on economically, in economic terms, in political terms, but one of the sharpest, clearest changes over the time that I was living there was that people began to talk about the country in moral terms. They began to talk about what was going on in sort of matters of the soul. And anybody, I think there's people here, I'm sure, who've been to China recently. You don't have to go very long before somebody comes up to you and says, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Taoist. There's this sense of activity, religious activity, and moral kind of conversation going on. At some point along the way, I lost touch with a friend named Lin Gu. He was a well-connected reporter and self-described social butterfly who took pride in never having turned on the stove in his apartment. When I asked around, a friend told me that Lin had moved to the mountains to begin training as a monk. Actually, what he told me was Lin had moved to the mountains to begin training as a hermit. And I thought, well, how am I going to get in touch with a hermit? But it turns out that a hermit, of course, has email, and it was not unheard of. China had recently passed a milestone to become the world's largest Buddhist nation. When Lin returned to Beijing on a break, we had dinner. I met him outside the subway. He was dressed in loose brown cotton, and his head was shaved. He was living in a remote community of 24 people, about 2 hours from the nearest city. "It's a cliché, right?" he said, and laughed. The middle-class Chinese monk. As a journalist in China, Lin had lived by what he called a golden rule: doubt everything. But Buddhism had given him answers that journalism never could. "I've been searching for the truth for a long time," he said. And what you find, at least in my experience, was that people have tried all of these different realms of life to try to get ultimately at what does it mean to be a person in 2015 in China. Some try to kind of actualize their significance by making a fortune. Other people, it's about standing up for political ideas that they believe in. But in the end, the Communist Party does a lot of things for people today in terms of economic activity, but it doesn't answer the basic questions, which is, what are you here for? What are your relationships what is your moral obligation to your neighbor, for instance? What's to stop you from producing products that you know are going to hurt people if it's going to make you a profit? Why shouldn't you do that? And so all of these kinds of moral questions are hanging out there in the sort of plain view, and people are taking it upon themselves to answer those kinds of questions. And so for me, I ended up spending a lot of time talking to people about what was going on, not in politics, not in economics, but inside themselves in a lot of ways.
A hermit with email leads me to my next question. That's about the role of the internet as an agent of change in China. You focus a lot on that in the book. It's fueled a lot of this independent thought and action. It's also caused the government to crack down and use the internet against people. How important has it been, and who wins out in this tug between individuals using the internet to find like-minded people and the government trying to shut down this kind of thought?
The internet as a phenomenon in China is amazing. I mean, if you think about it, there are now 600 million people in China online, so about half the population, a little less than half the population, give or take 200 million people. And so they're only halfway there. And for the people who are drawn into what the internet means, the experience is transformative. And I'll mention an example of what that sort of does to some. Well, I'll mention a different example. We talked about somebody earlier today, but I'll tell a different example, which is that, for a generation of young people who are growing up now with the internet, it is unimaginable to them that things that they have become accustomed to having will be unavailable. So the most popular television show in China is Big Bang Theory, and the American sitcom, and everybody was watching it online. And then about a year ago, without explanation, the government banned Big Bang Theory from the internet. And the thinking was, nobody really knew why, but it may be that they wanted to broadcast it on state television and have control over making some cuts to get rid of things they didn't want. Maybe they wanted to be able to have a sort of official licensed version. In any event, young people rose up in response, and they used what is the Chinese equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act, and students at Wuhan University filed an official request demanding to know why the Big Bang Theory had been withdrawn from the internet. And if you take that, what is the most benign possible use of kind of the political technology of this Freedom of Information Act, and then the sort of assumption that they deserve information of a certain kind, that is a powerful combination, and it's not clear where that really leads in China. At the moment, the government has done an extraordinarily effective job of maintaining control. I mean, I'm saying effective in a technocratic way, of maintaining control of the internet. It's the world's largest system of censorship, and I'm continually surprised at how able they actually are to shape what goes on this world that we think of as being sort of chaotic and unregulated of the web.
When you read your book, you're kind of astonished at the amount of discussion and criticism that the government will tolerate on the internet. But you're doing some reporting now and about to write a piece about how that's changing, that the government is now becoming much more hard line, and that's sort of what you see in the future.
Yeah, I think I made a mistake in some ways in my view, in my analysis, in my imagination of what was possible with the internet, and meaning Bill Clinton had a line where he said that trying to control and censor the internet is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And he said this back in the early days of the web in about '96. And he was talking about China, and he just struck him as implausible that you could try to contain this kind of protean force of the web and all the connected minds that came with that. But over the course of the last 18 months, I've been surprised by how the state has actually succeeded in sterilizing some of that humor and that criticism and some of these kinds of minor mutinies that are part of internet culture. Internet culture is based on being subversive in a certain sense. There is no hierarchy. Nobody ever gets to tell you where you rank in terms of your right to use the web. But it's in so many ways completely contrary to Communist Party culture. And so these two things are the web is about disclosure, the party is about maintaining appropriate secrets. The web is about this kind of leaderless world, the party ultimately is highly hierarchical. And so they're in a huge clash. And what we're seeing playing out right now, and it really is changing kind of month by month, is the degree to which the party is able to maintain or impose control over the internet. And ultimately what that means is creating a different internet. Because the internet inside China is now being gradually sequestered from the rest of the world, which is a phenomenon we've never really seen. I pose the question, which is how many countries in the world do we know where the internet connection to the outside world today is worse than it was a year ago? Very, very few places that I can think of that are not at war. And China is in the midst of that. And that worries me a bit. Worries me a lot, actually.
I wonder, actually, I managed to come up here without a clock, so we could be here all night. How much time do we have? 5 more minutes, is that all? Oh my God. Well,
was it something
10.
you said?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about U.S. government policy and U.S. reaction to both China and Afghanistan, and whether was there any way that any policy the U.S. Conceivably could have, and was politically possible, for the U.S. to counter China in a way that would have made this government, not begin to go in a hardline direction, or, to embrace China's growth and help move the government more toward democracy and more toward freedom?
I mean, I think historically we tend to overestimate our ability to shape the political character of other places, often at our peril. And when we involve ourselves, as Anand has described eloquently, it can end up in terrible circumstances. That being said, we also do play a specific role in the world, which is if we're true to our own values, if we're consistent in our values, if we say what we believe, there is value in that. Anybody who has talked to a political prisoner or a former political prisoner will tell you that it does matter to them when they find out that the Secretary of State of the United States said their name. And it sounds like the smallest thing in the world, but it matters because it provides a sense that they're not alone and that they actually matter in the world. I'm not of the belief that the United States should, can, would, will counter China's rise. I think that'd be a mistake. I think it's a fact of our time and a welcome fact that China, 1/5 of the world's population, is now gaining strength and connections, and we should embrace them as much as possible. And that means ultimately revising some of the institutions in the world, like the IMF and the World Bank, giving a greater share to, a greater voice to China. So I actually think that the challenge for us today is not about how to maintain the position that we have in the world relative to China. It's about how to encourage as much as we can China to participate in the institutions and to do our own side of the bargain, which is to try to make sure that we're doing what we can to keep those institutions up to date. And the last point I would mention on that is we're not actually doing that at the moment. There's a bill that's been in Congress for the last year plus, which is the IMF has basically agreed to give China greater voting rights. And this is now up to the U.S. Congress to approve it, and we haven't done it. And we haven't done it just because of inertia and because I live in Washington, D.C. I can, as you know, as well as I do, the Congress is not a place that's prone to activity. But as a result, China is taking the very clear message that we don't want them to join the world community. And that's a corrosive sensation, and I hope we can figure out a way to make them say, we want you to succeed, because if you succeed, the chances of us all succeeding are much greater.
Anand, how about in Afghanistan? You've told us how the U.S. missed an opportunity early in the war to get things better, if not right. Did we really have the capacity and the understanding to do the right thing then, and going forward, what's the way forward? What's the most we continue to spend billions of dollars there. Is there a way forward that's going to bring us to some kind of conclusion that we're satisfied with?
Well, I think we certainly had the capacity. The question of will is a different question. It turns out now, and I can say this with the benefit of hindsight, but it turns out that you can either pursue a strategy of counterterrorism or one of state building. And actually, it turns out you can't do both because they work at cross purposes. And what I mean by that is that counterterrorism privileges killing bad guys, it sort of creates processes in which we empower local actors to get these bad guys. That's the opposite of building institutions, which is what, in the long term, will actually be, I think, a solution to the problem of terrorism. If you take the Afghanistan case, and this applies to Iraq as well and other places, but in Afghanistan, just as an example, the Afghan National Police today is considered one of the most rapacious of the various security forces in Afghanistan. Very, very corrupt. And there was a choice, a real choice in how to build the Afghan National Police back in 2002 and 2003. What could have been done is to set up academies to hire Afghans from around the country. People wanted jobs, people were lining up, and I describe in my book, in fact, Mullah Cable actually tried to join the police. He actually went to the police headquarters to try to get a job. And so people who are eager for that, you can credential them, train them, etc. Instead, what happened was that the U.S. took a series of pre-existing militias and basically just put them together and called them the Afghan National Police. And the reason they did that is because these militias were the most effective at killing people, because they were already formations. They were, they had a command and control, they had a commander, they had guns, etc. And so there's an example of how we want to get terrorists right now without thinking down the line. And unfortunately, it's actually the case that the behavior of the Afghan police has actually inadvertently produced people who are now fighting against the government and the U.S. I think that's something that you're seeing now with some differences, but with a lot of similarities in Iraq. I was in Iraq in the autumn, and I traveled to a village about an hour south of Baghdad, and this is a place that had been controlled by ISIS for a number of months, and it was just liberated by the Iraqi army and by Shia militias. And so I pulled in literally like 2 days after ISIS had been cleared, and I was interested in sort of getting stories of people who had lived under ISIS to see what that was like. But what I found was something very different, which is that the Shia militias essentially assumed that every person who was living in the village, every man, woman, and child who was a Sunni was a terrorist or was a member of ISIS. And so they went house to house, they burned houses down, they beheaded people, they filmed the beheadings and put it up online. In fact, in the course of reporting this, I actually got arrested by the Shia militias. I got blindfolded, and they did mock executions on me and my two colleagues. Of course, I'm an American, so I was able to get out of this, but you can imagine if you're an Iraqi and you're in this situation. And that gave me a little bit more understanding to the very sort of grim fact that I learned, which is that almost every Sunni that I spoke to in Iraq viewed ISIS as a lesser of two evils to the Iraqi state. And to me, that's not only is it a major tragedy, but it's another example of how we are thinking in a very short-term way, supporting the Iraqi state for fighting terror, but not thinking about actually building an inclusive or helping to build an inclusive political order so that people don't feel like they have to turn towards ISIS or any of these other abominable groups.
We've just extended our support for Afghanistan in the past week. And under the new president, new president in Afghanistan, President Ghani, we're hopeful that things will go better. Are you hopeful that things will go better? Can you hope that things will go better?
I can hope that they won't get much worse, I think. This is the way I think about it. But even that's maybe a stretch, because this year was the most violent year on record since 2001 for the number of civilians who have been killed. And every year, if you look, it actually breaks the record of the previous year. And so the situation that we have right now is the Afghan government controls some cities. Out in the countryside, you have a patchwork of either warlord fiefdoms or insurgent territory. The Afghan government cannot collect any taxes, so it's utterly reliant on foreign aid for its existence. If the U.S. decides to stop the funding tomorrow, the Afghan government will collapse the day after tomorrow. There's 350,000 men under arms in Afghanistan fighting on behalf of the Afghan government. That means the Afghan army, the police, the militias. We're paying for all of them. And they're arrayed against 50,000, 60,000 Taliban fighters, and Afghan civilians are caught in between. So I think this is a war of attrition. I don't think either side is actually strong enough to defeat the other side, which is probably worse than one of the two sides winning. And so as long as we keep funding it, it's essentially going to be a war in perpetuity.
Well, I wish I could find a hopeful note, but I think...
Can I mention a hopeful note?
Yes.
Because this is a sincere thought, actually, about being here today. We've had a series of wonderful meetings with students, and I think all three of us have felt this, and we've talked about it. We've all been struck by the degree to which students are thinking about what's going on outside the United States, and there have never been more ways, more opportunities available for people to go. And one of the things that Concordia has done, I think, so expertly is encourage people to go and to go overseas and to see what's going on, so that, in a sense, these places stop feeling quite so impenetrable and forbidding and become just part of the world that we're living in. And I'm sort of encouraged by that fact, that these places, which even at these moments of real complexity, and I think neither of us sort of sugarcoat it, what's happening, but they are knowable places, and you can go. And I think there's a lot of young people who are here who are doing that, and that gives me great hope.
That's a hopeful note, and let's conclude on that. Thank you, Evan, Osnos, Anand Gopal.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for a wonderful evening.
I enjoyed that. That was great. I thought we covered it.
Thank you.